Before we dive into the shocking true story of MS-13, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what you're about to see isn't just a story, it's a real-life nightmare unfolding in American streets. Every video we release uncovers the hidden truths behind the most dangerous gangs, and you won't want to miss a single chapter. Watch closely, comment your thoughts, and join our community. Because understanding the world of MS-13 means seeing the fear, power, and survival that most people never dare to witness. In the early 1980s, Los Angeles was a city of contrasts, glamorous and gritty, prosperous and impoverished. Amidst this urban tapestry, a new and formidable force was emerging from the shadows. It was a time when the streets of LA were dominated by established gangs like the Crips and the Bloods, whose influence stretched across neighborhoods, dictating the rhythm of daily life. For many Salvadoran immigrants fleeing the Civil War back home, these streets were both a refuge and a battleground. Among these newcomers were young men, often teenagers, who found themselves displaced in a foreign land, struggling to navigate a society that viewed them as outsiders. They were caught between the trauma of war and the challenges of assimilation. In this environment, survival became paramount. The established gangs, predominantly composed of African Americans and Mexican Americans, were often hostile to these newcomers, viewing them as intruders in their territories. To protect themselves and assert their presence, these Salvadoran youths began to form their own groups. They adopted the name Mara Salvatrucha, a blend of their Salvadoran heritage and the street culture they were now part of. What started as a means of self-preservation quickly evolved into something more organized and dangerous. The Mara Salvatrucha, or MS-13, was born. The gang's early activities were marked by a series of violent turf wars with other street gangs. One of their most notable and brutal rivalries was with the 18th Street Gang. Initially, there was a semblance of cooperation between the two groups, as they shared a common enemy in the established gangs. However, as both gangs grew in power and numbers, competition for control over territory and illicit enterprises intensified. The streets of neighborhoods like Westlake, Pico Union, and Koreatown became flashpoints for these turf wars. Drive-by shootings, stabbings, and machete attacks were common occurrences. The violence was not just a means of asserting dominance, but also a way to instill fear and maintain control. For MS-13, brutality was both a weapon and a message. In these early years, the gang's leadership was decentralized, with various cliques operating semi-independently. However, as the gang's activities expanded, a more structured hierarchy began to emerge. Leaders like Ernesto Deras, a former Salvadoran Special Forces soldier, brought military discipline to the gang, transforming it into a more organized criminal enterprise. Under his leadership, MS-13 began to engage in more sophisticated criminal activities, including drug trafficking, extortion, and human smuggling. The gang's expansion was further fueled by the US government's immigration policies. In the aftermath of the Salvadoran Civil War, many MS-13 members who had been arrested were deported back to El Salvador. This mass deportation inadvertently facilitated the gang's spread to Central America, where it established a stronghold and continued its violent operations. The early history of MS-13 is a testament to the harsh realities faced by immigrants and the lengths to which they would go to survive and assert their identity. It also marks the beginning of a violent legacy that would span decades and continents. By the late 1980s, the streets of Los Angeles had become a crucible of violence, where every corner, alley, and vacant lot could erupt into bloodshed. The MS-13 gang, still young but growing fast, faced a world already ruled by established gangs like the 18th Street Gang, the Crips, and the Bloods. These were streets where reputation was everything, and every slight demanded retribution. For the Salvadoran youths of MS-13, survival meant not just defending themselves, but claiming a place in a city that seemed determined to push them to the margins. One of the earliest and bloodiest conflicts involved the 18th Street Gang. Initially, there was an uneasy truce. Both gangs shared common enemies among other Latino and black gangs, and they occasionally avoided direct confrontations. But as MS-13 grew in numbers and confidence, the fragile peace shattered. The struggle for dominance became inevitable. The streets of Pico Union and Westlake became war zones where rival groups stalked each other's territories, and every act of defiance could trigger a retaliatory killing. The violence escalated quickly. One incident that became notorious involved a late-night confrontation outside a corner store in Westlake. A small MS-13 clique, barely out of their teens, encountered a rival faction from 18th Street. A heated argument over territorial boundaries escalated, and before anyone could intervene, machetes flashed under the dim streetlights. Witnesses later recounted the chaos, screams echoing down narrow alleys, bodies falling to the asphalt, blood staining the cracked concrete. This was not just a fight, it was a message. Every strike, every wound was a warning. MS-13 would not back down. Fear became a weapon, as powerful as the knives and guns they wielded. MS-13 members understood that survival depended on reputation, and that silence, fearful silence among the public and rival gangs alike, was essential. They were both predators and specters, moving through the city with a mix of brutality and stealth. Rumors of their violence spread faster than the gang itself, deterring casual challengers and marking the beginning of their psychological dominance. The gang's internal structure began to solidify during these conflicts. Leaders emerged from the chaos, men whose ruthlessness earned them respect and loyalty. These leaders enforced strict codes: loyalty to the gang above all, immediate retaliation for any insult or attack, and the ruthless initiation of new members. Initiation rituals were often violent, requiring prospective members to commit acts of aggression to prove themselves. This ensured that every recruit was not only loyal, but also capable of contributing to the gang's growing arsenal of terror. MS-13's expansion was not limited to Los Angeles. By the early 1990s, the gang had extended its influence to other U.S. cities, including New York, Washington, D.C., and Boston. Wherever they went, they encountered new rivals and recreated the deadly patterns of turf warfare. In New York, the gang's Salvadoran members faced off against Dominican and Puerto Rican gangs, while in D.C. they clashed with local black street gangs over control of drug corners and recruitment territories. Each conflict mirrored the early confrontations in L.A., reinforcing the gang's reputation for merciless retaliation and unyielding loyalty. One of the most chilling aspects of these early turf wars was the gang's use of public violence to assert dominance. Drive-by shootings, public stabbings, and targeted attacks were not random. They were strategic, meant to send unmistakable signals to rivals and civilians alike. A murder in broad daylight was a statement: this is our territory. Anyone who challenged it would face the same fate. These acts of brutality were meticulously recorded in law enforcement files and media reports, cementing MS-13's image as one of the most feared gangs in America. Yet, the violence was not only against rivals. Betrayal within the gang itself was met with equal ferocity. Members who questioned leadership, failed to participate in attacks, or were suspected of cooperating with authorities were eliminated swiftly. Fear and blood intertwined, creating a cycle that kept both members and enemies on edge. Even the public learned to remain silent. Speaking out meant risking life and limb. Communities lived under a constant oppressive shadow where violence was normalized and survival required complicity or invisibility. Despite, or perhaps because of, this brutality, MS-13's influence grew. They became a dominant force not only in criminal enterprises, but in shaping the street culture of immigrant communities. The gang was a paradox, both a product of displacement and trauma and a creator of terror and instability. Its power rested not on wealth alone, but on the ability to instill fear, enforce silence, and dominate through unrelenting violence. These early conflicts, though deeply violent and tragic, laid the foundation for the gang's future. They created a network of loyal cliques, an established hierarchy, and a fearsome reputation that transcended neighborhoods and states. The young Salvadoran refugees, who had once been powerless, now controlled corners of American cities through fear and bloodshed. And in every act of violence, every territorial claim, and every retaliatory strike, the unspoken code was clear: MS-13 would not only survive, it would dominate. By the mid-1990s, MS-13 had evolved from a small, localized gang in Los Angeles into a sprawling, multi-state criminal organization. And with this growth came new challenges and even deadlier confrontations. Their reputation for ruthless violence had spread beyond California, carried by deportations of gang members back to El Salvador, and by the migration of new recruits to other urban centers across the United States. Wherever MS-13 emerged, they brought a singular combination of discipline, terror, and an unyielding desire for territorial dominance. In cities like New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C., the gang encountered landscapes vastly different from the streets of Los Angeles. Here, immigrant populations were scattered, and local gangs often held long-standing control over neighborhoods. MS-13's arrival immediately threatened these balances. They were outsiders, Salvadoran immigrants in regions dominated by Dominican, Puerto Rican, and African American gangs, yet they were not deterred. What they lacked in numbers initially, they compensated with brutal precision, coordinated attacks, and an unflinching adherence to the code of blood and silence. One notorious incident in Long Island, New York, illustrates the early stages of MS-13's expansion. A small clique of Salvadoran teenagers had settled in a working-class neighborhood, drawn by cheap housing and a growing immigrant community. Their presence quickly attracted the attention of local gangs who perceived them as a threat to their drug trade and territorial control. On a humid summer night, a violent clash erupted outside a convenience store. Knives and baseball bats were wielded with lethal intent. Bullets shattered glass windows, and bystanders scattered in terror. Witnesses reported seeing multiple gang members lying bloodied on the asphalt. This violent confrontation solidified MS-13's reputation in the region and signaled that they would stop at nothing to claim their space. As MS-13's presence spread, so did the complexity of their internal organization. The gang was no longer a loose assembly of young Salvadorans. It had developed a sophisticated hierarchy that allowed it to coordinate operations across cities. Leaders, often former combatants from the Salvadoran Civil War, used military-style discipline and communication methods to oversee recruitment, enforce loyalty, and manage violent operations. These leaders also established networks for drug trafficking, extortion, and human smuggling, ensuring that the gang's influence extended far beyond street corners into organized crime. The expansion inevitably led to violent confrontations with rival gangs across the country. In Boston, MS-13 clashed repeatedly with local Irish-American and African-American gangs over control of street corners and the heroin trade. In Washington, D.C., Salvadoran gangs faced off against established Latino and Black gangs, often in coordinated attacks designed to intimidate and eliminate opposition. Each battle reinforced the gang's brutal reputation, with acts of violence deliberately publicized to instill fear. These confrontations were not mere street fights. They were calculated campaigns to assert dominance, control territory, and maintain the aura of invincibility that had become synonymous with MS-13. The gang's methodology combined fear, secrecy, and spectacle. Violence was ritualized. Machetes, firearms, and even knives were not just tools, but symbols of authority and warning. In many neighborhoods, residents learned to recognize MS-13's marks, graffiti, tattoos, or even the choice of weapon as indicators that the gang was claiming control. Silence was mandatory. Witnesses who spoke out faced threats, assaults, or worse. This system of terror created an almost invisible influence that extended beyond the immediate violence, shaping communities through fear rather than constant presence. However, MS-13's expansion also exposed the gang to internal tensions and betrayals. As new cliques were established in distant cities, the central leadership struggled to maintain strict control. Rivalries between local factions sometimes escalated into deadly feuds. Members who disobeyed orders, failed to participate in attacks, or showed weakness were often executed, sometimes by their own peers. These internal purges served a dual purpose. They reinforced discipline and loyalty, and they perpetuated the culture of fear that allowed the gang to maintain cohesion despite its sprawling presence. One of the most significant consequences of MS-13's multi-state expansion was the increased attention from law enforcement. Federal and local authorities began coordinating operations to track and dismantle the gang's networks. Joint task forces, surveillance operations, and undercover investigations were launched in New York, Boston, and Los Angeles. High-profile arrests and prosecutions targeted both the foot soldiers and the leadership, but the gang proved resilient. Its decentralized structure meant that the removal of a few leaders did not cripple operations. Instead, new leaders quickly emerged, often more ruthless than their predecessors. Despite these challenges, MS-13's reach continued to grow. By the early 2000s, the gang had established a presence in dozens of American cities, each marked by violent turf wars with local gangs. The Salvadoran American community, once largely ignored by law enforcement, now faced a reality where youth recruitment into MS-13 was common and the shadow of violence loomed over everyday life. Families lived in fear of retaliation if they intervened or spoke out, perpetuating a cycle of silence that allowed the gang to thrive. MS-13's multi-state expansion illustrates a terrifying paradox. The gang's members were often victims themselves, children of war and displacement, yet they became instruments of terror, exporting violence wherever they went. Each new city brought new rivalries, new killings, and new challenges, but also new opportunities for dominance. The story of MS-13's expansion is not only a chronicle of criminal power, but also a study in how fear, discipline, and loyalty can transform marginalized youth into one of the most violent criminal organizations in American history. By the late 1990s, MS-13 had grown into a sprawling criminal empire across multiple American cities. Its power seemed unshakable, but the very traits that fueled its rise, brutality, loyalty, and a rigid code of silence, also made it dangerously volatile. Within the gang, loyalty was paramount, but trust was fragile. Every act of defiance, every perceived betrayal, threatened not only the individual, but the cohesion of the entire organization. Blood, once spilled for survival and dominance, became the currency of internal control. In Los Angeles, the birthplace of MS-13 in the United States, cliques began competing for control of neighborhoods, drug corners, and recruitment networks. The original Salvadoran members, hardened by civil war and street violence, demanded obedience and feared weakness. New recruits, often teenagers, sometimes bristled at the harsh rules or tried to assert autonomy. Such moments were rare but deadly. Members who showed hesitation or questioned orders were labeled traitors, and punishment was swift, merciless, and public. Bodies were left in alleys or abandoned lots as warnings to anyone who might consider disloyalty. One of the most infamous cases involved a young member in Pico Union who was suspected of cooperating with law enforcement after a failed drug deal drew attention from local police. The gang's leadership convened a secret council in an abandoned warehouse, debating how to respond. The decision was unanimous. The boy would be executed. He was lured under the pretense of a routine meeting, and in the shadows he was stabbed multiple times by his own peers. The act was filmed by the gang and circulated as both a warning and a ritual, reinforcing the terror that underpinned MS-13's code. The message was clear. Betrayal would never be tolerated, and silence was mandatory. Meanwhile, rivalries between cliques within the same city escalated into deadly conflicts. Los Angeles alone saw dozens of internal feuds where members turned on each other over territory disputes or personal vendettas. In New York, similar dynamics played out as Salvadoran cliques clashed over control of local drug operations. These internal wars were as violent as confrontations with outside gangs. Each killing reinforced fear, but also eroded any sense of camaraderie, creating a culture where every handshake could conceal a threat and every ally could become an enemy. The consequences of these betrayals were not confined to gang members alone. Families, friends, and innocent bystanders were often caught in the crossfire. Witnesses who tried to intervene were threatened or targeted, further silencing communities. In neighborhoods controlled by MS-13, fear became an invisible barrier, ensuring compliance and obedience. No one could speak freely, and the line between victim and perpetrator blurred. Ordinary life was punctuated by sudden violence, leaving psychological scars that lingered for decades. Power struggles within MS-13 also created openings for outside gangs to exploit. Rival organizations such as the 18th Street Gang observed these internal fractures and sometimes launched attacks to seize territory or recruit disillusioned members. These external pressures intensified the gang's internal paranoia, prompting more purges and violent demonstrations of loyalty. It was a vicious cycle. The stronger the gang appeared outwardly, the more fragile it was beneath the surface. Every act of violence became both a weapon and a shield, an attempt to consolidate authority while defending against both internal and external threats. A particularly chilling example occurred in Boston, where MS-13 cliques had established a foothold in immigrant neighborhoods. A faction of younger members, frustrated by the dominance of older Salvadoran leaders, attempted to assert independence. The rebellion was quickly crushed. One night, a group of older leaders cornered the dissenters in a parking lot. Blades and firearms were used to execute the punishment with precision and terror. News of the incident spread quickly through local networks, ensuring that future challengers understood the cost of disloyalty. This event exemplified the extreme measures the gang would take to enforce unity and maintain the illusion of unbreakable authority. MS-13's internal conflicts were not limited to acts of revenge. They extended to personal rivalries, jealousy, and competition over influence and recognition. Leadership positions, often coveted, were defended with lethal resolve. Members who showed promise or charisma could be both an asset and a threat. The gang's culture rewarded ambition only when it was fully subordinated to collective loyalty. Independent thinking, questioning orders, or pursuing personal agendas was a gamble with life or death consequences. These betrayals and rivalries also had long-term consequences for the gang's operations. While fear and violence maintained discipline, they also led to instability. Frequent internal purges weakened certain cliques temporarily, created mistrust among members, and sometimes caused strategic missteps in confrontations with rival gangs. Yet paradoxically, this very brutality contributed to MS-13's notoriety. Communities, rivals, and law enforcement alike viewed the gang as unpredictable, dangerous, and omnipresent. The fear they inspired became a tool as potent as the weapons they carried. By the turn of the century, it was clear that MS-13's power was inseparable from its internal violence. Betrayals and rivalries were not anomalies, they were structural, integral to the gang's identity. Blood was not just spilled in the streets against enemies, it was spilled within, shaping hierarchy, enforcing discipline, and ensuring that fear permeated every corner of their territory. In this world, loyalty was enforced through terror, silence was survival, and betrayal guaranteed death. Ultimately, the story of MS-13's internal struggles is a testament to the paradox of power built on fear. The gang thrived because of its violence, yet the same violence threatened to undo it from within. Every betrayal, every rival faction, every purge reinforced the deadly lessons that governed life inside the gang. Obey, fight, and never, ever speak. It was a brutal ecosystem of loyalty and treachery, a dark world where survival was measured in blood, and silence was the only language that could guarantee it. By the early 2000s, MS-13 had firmly entrenched itself across multiple American cities, and its notoriety had caught the attention of law enforcement on both local and federal levels. The gang's ruthless tactics, extensive criminal network, and ability to instill fear made it one of the most dangerous organizations operating in the United States. Yet, the decentralized structure that had allowed the gang to expand also presented opportunities for authorities to strike. What began as routine street policing evolved into a coordinated, nationwide campaign aimed at dismantling one of the most violent gangs in modern American history. Federal and local agencies collaborated through multi-agency task forces, sharing intelligence on MS-13 operations in cities from Los Angeles and New York to Washington, D.C. and Boston. The FBI, DEA, ATF, and ICE coordinated with local police departments to identify key leaders, map the gang's networks, and track criminal activities, including drug trafficking, extortion, human smuggling, and violent assaults. It was a meticulous and dangerous operation, often relying on informants who risked their lives to provide insight into the inner workings of the gang. One of the most high-profile operations occurred in Long Island, New York, where law enforcement targeted a powerful MS-13 clique responsible for a wave of murders and assaults. Undercover agents infiltrated local networks, posing as gang associates or criminal collaborators. Surveillance was conducted around the clock, tracking movements, meetings, and illicit transactions. Each step was fraught with danger. MS-13 members were hyper-vigilant and had a history of eliminating perceived threats without hesitation. The tension was palpable, as a single misstep could expose officers to lethal retaliation. The operation culminated in a series of coordinated raids across multiple locations, targeting key leaders and foot soldiers simultaneously. In one apartment complex, heavily armed SWAT teams stormed a unit where intelligence indicated a meeting of top MS-13 figures. The scene was chaotic. Members attempted to flee, weapons were seized, and several high-ranking leaders were arrested. The arrests sent shockwaves through the gang, temporarily destabilizing the hierarchy and signaling to other members that law enforcement could penetrate even the most secure operations. Yet for every leader removed, the gang adapted. MS-13's survival depended on its resilience, loyalty, and the rapid emergence of new leaders, willing to uphold the brutal codes established by their predecessors. These new leaders often operated with even more secrecy and sophistication, aware that federal agencies were constantly watching. Communication became more encrypted, meetings moved to less accessible locations, and violent retaliation became a strategic deterrent against informants and rivals alike. The gang's capacity to recover quickly from law enforcement strikes underscored its ability to survive under extreme pressure. The scale of law enforcement operations extended beyond arrests. Authorities sought to dismantle the financial networks underpinning the gang's activities. Money laundering, drug proceeds, and extortion payments were tracked, frozen, and seized whenever possible. Yet, the decentralized and clandestine nature of MS-13's operations made this a constant challenge. Each city or clique had its own system of revenue, often hidden through front businesses, cash-only transactions, or informal remittance channels. Law enforcement's approach had to be adaptive, combining investigative work with community outreach to gather intelligence and protect witnesses. The psychological aspect of enforcement was equally significant. MS-13 thrived on fear, both within its own ranks and in surrounding communities. Arresting leaders, exposing networks, and publicizing convictions was intended not only to disrupt operations, but also to undermine the gang's aura of invincibility. Yet, for many members, the arrests became a call to action, a reinforcement of the gang's ethos of retaliation and survival. In New York and Los Angeles, law enforcement observed that violent incidents sometimes surged immediately following major raids, as members sought to assert dominance and intimidate rivals and authorities alike. One case that illustrates the complex dynamic between law enforcement and MS-13 occurred in El Salvador, where deported gang members were re-establishing cliques. U.S. authorities worked with international partners to monitor cross-border connections, drug routes, and financial transfers. Arrests in the United States sometimes triggered coordinated violence abroad, demonstrating the gang's ability to operate transnationally. The cat-and-mouse game was relentless. Each strike by authorities prompted adaptation, concealment, and escalation by the gang. Despite the relentless pressure, law enforcement victories were significant. High-profile arrests and prosecutions disrupted operations, prevented potential murders, and sent a message to communities and rival gangs alike. Witnesses and victims felt a measure of justice, and media coverage highlighted the consequences of violent gang activity. Yet, the resilience of MS-13 remained a sobering reminder that dismantling a gang built on fear, loyalty, and violence required more than arrests. It required constant vigilance, intelligence, and community cooperation. The story of law enforcement versus MS-13 is, in many ways, a study in persistence and adaptation. The gang's violent legacy and decentralized structure created one of the most challenging law enforcement targets in modern U.S. history. Every arrest, raid, and conviction had an impact, but the underlying forces, displacement, poverty, trauma, and the allure of gang loyalty ensured that new members would continue to emerge. The balance of power was delicate, and each encounter, each operation, highlighted the ongoing struggle to suppress violence while protecting communities. Ultimately, the hunt for MS-13 leaders demonstrates the paradox of power and survival. The gang's members were products of trauma and displacement, yet they became architects of terror. Law enforcement efforts sought to dismantle these networks, yet the gang's resilience, brutality, and adaptability allowed it to persist. The battle between authorities and MS-13 is not only a story of arrests and raids, it is a saga of human fear, loyalty, and the unrelenting struggle for control, both within the gang and in the cities it terrorizes. The cycle of violence, retaliation, and survival continues, a grim testament to the enduring presence of one of America's most notorious gangs. The story of MS-13 is not just one of blood, machetes, and bullets. It is a story of communities scarred, families fractured, and lives irreversibly changed by fear. Decades of violence have left indelible marks on the neighborhoods where the gang took root, and the legacy of terror extends far beyond the headlines and crime reports. For every gang member, there is a ripple of impact. Friends lost, parents grieving, and children growing up in a climate of uncertainty and anxiety. The gang's reach has been both physical and psychological, and its shadow lingers in cities across the United States. In many Salvadoran American neighborhoods, MS-13's presence was synonymous with intimidation. Residents learned early that silence was a survival mechanism. Witnesses to violence, those who spoke out against the gang, or families who refused to pay extortion fees risked retaliation. Children grew up seeing their peers recruited at alarming rates, often as young as 12 or 13. Schools, parks, and local streets became arenas where gang influence dictated not only behavior, but possibilities for the future. The fear instilled by MS-13 ensured compliance, but it also created generational trauma, leaving young people with a sense of inevitability about violence as a normal part of life. The human cost of the gang's operations is staggering. Families have been torn apart by murder, incarceration, and deportation. Parents of gang members often lived in constant fear for their children, unable to prevent their descent into criminal life. Siblings and friends witnessed brutality firsthand, sometimes compelled to participate in acts of violence themselves to demonstrate loyalty. The psychological scars, nightmares, hypervigilance, and post-traumatic stress extend far beyond the individuals directly involved, infiltrating entire communities. The culture of silence ensured that these traumas were rarely discussed, compounding the impact on mental health and social cohesion. MS-13's legacy also includes its influence on rival gangs and the broader criminal ecosystem. In cities like Los Angeles, New York, and Boston, the gang's violent tactics set new standards for intimidation and control. Rival gangs adapted, escalating their own methods to compete. Drug territories became battlefields, and public killings were increasingly used to send messages. Law enforcement and community organizations were forced to respond not just to individual crimes, but to an entrenched system of fear that dictated social behavior and shaped the urban landscape. Yet amidst the devastation, there are stories of resilience and survival. Former members who escaped the gang's grip, often at great personal risk, have shared testimonies of life inside MS-13. They describe a world where loyalty and fear were intertwined, where every decision could mean life or death. These accounts serve as warnings and lessons, highlighting the conditions that allow such gangs to flourish: poverty, displacement, lack of opportunity, and the absence of social support networks. By understanding these factors, communities and authorities can develop more effective prevention strategies to keep at-risk youth from being drawn into cycles of violence. One poignant example comes from El Salvador, where deported MS-13 members re-established cliques that continued to terrorize local communities. Families there recounted the relentless pressure to conform, the constant threat of retaliation, and the omnipresence of violence in daily life. Children learned early that stepping out of line could have fatal consequences. In the United States, similar stories unfold in neighborhoods where immigrant families live under the shadow of MS-13 influence. The lesson is clear. Violence, fear, and control are not just tools of crime. They are instruments for shaping behavior, enforcing obedience, and perpetuating cycles of trauma. The gang's legacy also reaches into the judicial system. Courts, law enforcement agencies, and social services have been forced to confront the long-term consequences of MS-13's presence. Witness protection programs, youth intervention initiatives, and anti-gang task forces were created in response to the pervasive fear and violence. Every arrest and conviction not only neutralized immediate threats, but also served as a societal acknowledgement of the damage inflicted by the gang. Yet despite these efforts, the underlying social conditions that allow gangs to thrive, displacement, marginalization, and lack of opportunity remain, highlighting the complexity of addressing the problem. For communities, the impact is multifaceted. Economically, neighborhoods with high MS-13 activity often suffer from reduced investment, business closures, and diminished property values. Psychologically, residents cope with chronic stress, anxiety, and the constant need for vigilance. Socially, trust erodes as neighbors fear both the gang and the potential consequences of cooperation with authorities. MS-13's influence is not just measured in crime statistics, but in the subtle, pervasive ways it reshapes daily life, instilling a sense of impermanence, danger, and vulnerability. Yet the human spirit persists. Community leaders, activists, and former gang members work tirelessly to reclaim spaces, provide alternatives for youth, and break cycles of violence. Mentorship programs, educational initiatives, and outreach efforts aim to provide hope where fear once dominated. Stories of former members who turned away from the gang and became advocates, teachers, or social workers demonstrate that while MS-13's legacy is powerful, it is not absolute. Change, though difficult, is possible. Ultimately, the legacy of MS-13 is a stark reminder of the cost of violence, the fragility of communities, and the enduring impact of fear. Bloodshed and silence have left deep wounds, but the lessons are clear. Understanding the roots of gang formation, addressing social inequities, and providing paths away from crime are essential. The story of MS-13 is not just about terror and brutality. It is a cautionary tale about displacement, survival, and the consequences of allowing fear to govern lives. The gang may leave scars, but the resilience of individuals and communities offers a counter-narrative, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit in